Bitte. Hello, my name is Gianluca Sergi. I'm a professor of film industries at the University of Nottingham in the UK. And I also work as a consultant for film and television companies around the world, particularly in Hollywood, in Los Angeles. I specialize in business models, innovation, and as part of innovation also on AI, artificial intelligence. I became interested in artificial intelligence as I was doing a project on innovation in the film industry a couple of years ago. The project was for some studios in Los Angeles, and it became obvious that artificial intelligence was becoming rapidly an important area of innovation, but it was also an area that very few people understood. And not just from a technological perspective, but also, most importantly, perhaps, in terms of the implications that it would have on the industry. And when I talk about industry, I mean everybody. I mean the producers, the studio, the filmmakers, the technology developers, and then eventually, of course, audiences as well. My latest project was with the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, that we all know as the Oscars, in Los Angeles this past December, on a project on AI. It was about trying to understand the main areas where conversation needs to take place for a fair and safe development of AI in film. As I was saying, over the past year, the topic of artificial intelligence and the potential impact on everybody working in the film industry has become the biggest topic of conversation in the world, but in particular in Hollywood. As it happened, the two of the biggest organizations representing filmmakers, the Writers Guild of America, the term guild effectively means a union in this particular context. So Union for Writers and the Guild for Actors, the Union for Actors, were renegotiating their contracts. And one of the key elements of that renegotiation was, in fact, artificial intelligence. Both writers and actors, and we can talk about this obviously if you want, had specific concerns, fears about the introduction of AI in their field, and so all unions, both guilds, ended up going on strike. And as you know, we are now suffering the consequences of those strikes. But when I say suffering, it has to be said that it was also the right thing to do. It was perfectly fair and right for both writers and actors to demand and expect that studios should approach this from a responsible perspective. So that was the beginning, the spark for the conversation in the film industry about AI, which is now taking place in a lot of different areas, not just for writers and actors. I think certainly one of the most important things to come out of those conversations over the past year has been a greater understanding of what are the key questions and what are the key areas of concern. For instance, one is everybody knows about copyright. If you are an artist of any kind, whether you're a writer, an actor, an editor, an illustrator, whatever, you want to make sure that if your work is ingested by one of these big language learning models that are the backbone of artificial intelligence systems, that your work is fairly compensated, and at the very least, at least credited accordingly, so that people know that this was inspired by you and not just simply created by a machine. As you can imagine, it's a very complicated issue, and there is a lot of debate, both on the part of governments and organizations trying to legislate or regulate the sector, and then on the part of studios and, of course, also filmmakers. So that was certainly one thing. Perhaps the most important thing that became obvious was the issue of trust. How do we build trust in the industry around artificial intelligence. And that to me is the key, absolutely the key point. Because we can talk about credit, copyright, image rights, fair compensation, all of that. But unless the issue of trust is addressed and hopefully resolved, I think we're going to be having these kind of conversations for a very long time. There isn't enough information to make that kind of prediction. In other words, to answer that question. What information there is slightly contradictory. It seems to point into different directions. So on the one hand, it's clear that audiences pay particular attention to this issue of human-generated content, and they prefer, wherever possible, to have real human-generated content. However, there is a significant evidence also that there are examples of how AI-generated material may in fact show that there is an appetite for it. I can give you one example. I was talking to a friend not long ago. There are now influencers online that are entirely AI-generated. They don't exist. If I were to hazard an opinion, I would say that it's possible that we're going to go towards a system where, yes, there will be material that is entirely AI generated, but that it will have to be heavily notified that it is to the audience. And as a consequence, it's likely that it will have a slightly different place in the ecosystem of entertainment. Maybe cheaper. Maybe as part of cinema, maybe cinemas might have a screen where they show this kind of material. But the idea that an entirely AI-generated film may replace a fully developed human-driven and generated movie, I don't think so. I don't see it. I don't see it for a very long time, if ever, to be honest with you. It's important to remember that artificial intelligence is, after all, another tool, like many other tools that have been created over the past 100 years. It is potentially more powerful, and it is also potentially more disruptive. There's no question about that. But all depends on how we use it. So Sora, which has just been released by OpenAI, which is the company behind ChatGPT, is the first to use text prompts to generate fully formed videos. So you can say to the computer, create a 60-second video of two people walking through Tokyo, Japan during spring, which is in fact one of the videos that they have created. And it will fairly quickly generate exactly that. And it will look photorealistic enough that if you don't know that it's generated by AI, you may be fooled for a moment or two that it is real. But ultimately, you have to ask yourself the question, even if that's true, what are the advantages? What are the best applications of that technology? Now, it could be, for instance, it's going to be very useful in terms of visualizing an idea before you actually put it into practice. And like that, I see absolutely no problem with that. It's not a bad idea. After all, we've been doing this for a long time, using a pencil and paper, storyboarding, and then using computers to do animated storyboards, and then using visual effects to do almost fully developed scenes before they're actually shot. So this is another step forward, and it actually, in many ways, makes it easier for everybody, including those who don't have access to a lot of money and a lot of resources, to do this. So that's not a bad thing, but as a step towards the actual then product, right? Not as the product. So I think in that respect, as an in-between step between idea and actual production, I think it's a very interesting tool. No question. And a lot of people are already saying that in areas like education, training, and so on, this kind of tool may be very significant moving forward. But again, we go back to the fundamental issue is, will people accept this if you ask them to take it as real? That's another story, right? As an animation, as a particularly sophisticated animation, yes, why not? I don't see why not. As a real film with real people really engaging and interacting with each other, I think we're not there yet, and who knows if we will ever be there. I think this is a very simple answer. The answer is yes, absolutely. Any AI-generated content should have a label that says clearly this was generated by AI. And in fact, it should have a lot more than that. That label should do more than just simply telling you that this was generated by AI. It should also give you certainty that it was generated fairly, and it was generated not with material borrowed from the internet without proper remuneration for the people originally responsible for it. And this goes back to the issue of trust. If you really want to build trust in the AI tools that are going to become available amongst filmmakers and amongst audiences, I'm absolutely certain that we are going to go towards some form of certification, some form of labeling that will say clearly, okay, this was done with AI, maybe it's going to be called responsible AI or some other formal words, that did not steal work from someone else, that did properly acknowledge the work that is based on. And so that audiences can confidently make a judgment as to whether they like what they're seeing or not, but they know where it generated, where it came from. The specific way in which that material is going to be labeled and at what point in the process is labeled is a subject of conversation. That question is obviously very important for anybody who works in a creative sector, but it's also important for those, as I was telling you before, audiences who go and see programs that want to feel safe, that what they are paying for is fair and has properly remunerated, paid, recognized the artists behind the original work. At the moment, it's a bit like the Far West, to be honest. It's everything goes. There are different systems of control over this, depending on where you are. So the European Union has just passed the AI Act, which is the first comprehensive set of legislation, in other words, laws, everybody will have to follow. And that, incidentally, interestingly, includes any company that may be based somewhere else, for instance, in the US or in China. But if they want to be present in the EU, they will have to follow the rules and regulations of the AI Act. So whatever you think of the European Union, they're actually the first body of such size to actually come up with proper legislation. China also has strict legislation around the use of AI. They have actually also legislated fairly severely against misuse of AI. But the situation is very different besides these two. So the US at the moment does not have legislation, in other words, laws, and it's highly unlikely that it will do so. So it's moving towards a system of what is known as self-governance or a voluntary code. So these are the rules, in inverted commas, the rules, and it would be nice if you follow them. But if you don't follow them, there is no law to force you to follow them. And so, in other words, it's left to the companies to be responsible. That is, in the past has not worked that well in other sectors. So I don't see why it should work this time, but there may be a financial interest, if nothing else, for companies to follow rules and regulation. Now, you mentioned the New York Times versus OpenAI. right? It's a case that is now being discussed in the United States, and OpenAI is the company heavily financed by Microsoft, by the way, that is behind ChatGPT. So the lawsuit in question is very interesting because the New York Times claims, and this is being discussed, so we don't have yet a resolution to this. The New York Times claims that ChatGPT, and therefore OpenAI, scraped, which is the technical word, in other words, stole a lot of information from the New York Times online without paying the New York Times or acknowledging that the material was from the New York Times, and then repackaged that information into articles that were published. Now, the copyright law, because there's something called fair use, this is when it becomes a little bit technical, there's something called fair use. So, for instance, when I teach at university, I can show clips from movies without having to pay the company any money because it is covered under the fair usage law, right? So OpenAI suggests that the fair use covers also this. It covers them scraping information and then repackaging them. But the New York Times has now made a case that they are suggesting that effectively OpenAI has reproduced what they had already published in a way that is not sufficiently different from the original. So effectively, it's very close to what the New York Times had done. There are entire passages that are exactly word for word what the article in the New York Times were. So if the New York Times won, this would be a real significant headache for companies like OpenAI, because they would suddenly be forced to stop doing it and find a way to agree on a contract basis with every single source of material that they may ever wish to use. So I would say, every 10,000 articles will pay you $1,000 or whatever, right? But they need to agree, which means that they would have to stop scraping the internet, because anybody who scraped comebackfilm or anyone else would have to have an agreement of some kind, a contract, right? So you think that's a good thing, and we can agree or disagree. But for innovators, for those who are developing now AI, if that came true, it would be a significant blow to their possibilities of developing AI. So the conversation now is, let's have a look at this particular case. I'm sure it's not the last that will come up. And in fact, this is the most likely scenario that then eventually creates, in practice, a legal framework where, here in the EU, we will have the AI Act. In the US, there will be case law. In other words, court decisions that will become effectively the law. This is how law in the US works. Is much more based. Europe is different in that respect. We legislate at source. In the US, they prefer to let the law become evident. Application of existing laws become evident through court cases, and this is one of the most important ones now. So we'll see what happens. A lot of people say that OpenAI and the New York Times probably will find an agreement out of court before that is determined. So there are different approaches to this. Every country, I think every government now recognizes that it's too big and too dangerous to leave it to the market. There has to be some form of government control. Also because there are very few companies in the hands of which AI is being developed, and so you don't want 9-10 companies to effectively rule the world through technology. So clearly every government wants to make sure that AI is properly regulated. The EU is going down the legal route, and I have to say it's fairly comprehensive. The AI Act is an interesting attempt at finding a set of rules that works, and it's done by areas of risk, as you might know. So the EU has decided there are going to be 4 different areas of risk. One is, risk that is too high and therefore too dangerous, and therefore it needs to be banned. One obvious example for this is profiling, or using AI to identify people in the middle of a road, or do kind of things, the kind of things that would be serious threat to individual freedom. Policing through AI, in other words, use of AI for police, is going to be allowed only under certain specific circumstances, particularly in terms of danger, possible danger to people. But that was one of the fundamental risks that people felt in general terms about freedom, how you could use AI. Okay, that's for the EU, but for instance, already in the UK, the situation is different. The UK government has taken an approach which they call pro-innovation. And the reason why they call it pro-innovation, or in favor of innovation, is because according to them, the type of legislation that the EU has introduced will protect people, but will also stifle, in other words, reduce the possibility of innovation. And that would in turn become a negative factor for the population. So the UK government thinks that there has to be a balance between regulation and innovation. And so they are going to have some rules, but not as laws probably, and certainly not as strong as the EU. The US is another step further removed from the EU. And although they have looked very carefully at the EU Act, the AI Act, because they are really interested in what the EU has done, they are going to take a different route. So there's going to be some protection. That protection is going to be probably left to the states. California, for instance, has already introduced legislation, and he may, in fact, introduce further legislation. But other states may decide to leave it pretty much to self-governance and allow companies not to do what they want, but certainly almost that. There are various different ways in which people are trying to regulate it. It's extremely difficult, but the EU, I think, has been very proactive in this respect, and in effect it's basically said it doesn't matter if your company is based in California or based in China or based somewhere else. If you want to have a presence in the EU territory, then you have to follow EU rules. So if people want to use ChatGPT needs to be compliant, at least in Europe, with European regulations. So this creates an interesting set of questions for all the big technology developers, and every nation then need to follow those basic guidelines. Accountability: if something happens, can you actually sue, for instance, the company or not? Because at the moment you can't. Security and privacy: am I safe? Is my data secure? Is my data private? So these are the key areas that all governments are fully aware now that there is a significant problem. So everybody's trying to work out the best way to address this without stopping innovation. First of all, that this is not just a technological issue. The issue is not just to find the right kind of technology to do what you want to do. It is an issue that involves ethics and ethical questions, because the way in which you approach the ethical questions involved here, some of which are very practical and some are a little bit more philosophical perhaps, but very important. If you don't take into account that combination of technology and ethics, I think you're never going to find a good way to ensure that you can work safely, responsibly, and fairly in the marketplace. So first of all, dialogue is very important. And I would strongly urge all companies to engage directly with people like me who does this precisely to try and help you organize a strategy for your company that makes sense, because it's unlikely that your company and other companies will have already people inside their company that understand this and all the implications. You need somebody from outside to help. Number one. Number two, again, the issue of trust is essential. It's easy to say and be cynical, right? It's easy to say, oh, well, this is the end. If my client, if you make, short advertising material, if my client can open a computer and type, make me a movie in the style of Martin Scorsese about my new kitchen tool, and it appears in 60 seconds, why would they come to you? That is why I think it's so important to have those conversations about ethics. If you think that people ultimately want to do the right thing, then put your customers in the best possible condition to do so, to do the right thing. If you, on the other hand, you start from a cynical perspective that all that your customers are interested in is just saving some money, well, you might as well look for another line of work, because this is going to be over. So I think ultimately people will pay for quality, for premium, and the idea of human-generated content will become a label itself. And there is a market for that because it's quality and people are prepared to pay for quality. I think it would be a mistake to misunderstand the fundamental nature of human beings and being too negative about this. But certainly it is a significant challenge to the environment. So if you just continue to do what you're doing without addressing these issues, I think you're not going to last very long. If you, on the other hand, see it for what it is, a tool, and find the best way to use it in conversation with experts who can help you and in conversation with your customers, that dialogue is the best guarantee that you have to ensure that everybody wins rather than everybody loses. That is very important for the future of companies in general, and also individuals, but it very much depends on where you are. So for instance, US law, so American law, says that you cannot patent or trademark. In other words, it cannot make it, legally yours, IP, unless it was entirely generated, not partly, entirely generated by a human. So there is a case where somebody tried to copyright something that had been generated by AI, and the courts decided that he could not copyright the material because it was generated by AI. Different nations may have different rules. So, but at the moment, however, there has to be a human, not behind the AI, but a human behind the creation. So if you do a video with Sora and you are one of your customers and you put it out on the internet, you don't own the copyright to that. It's not yours. This is why it's important to have experts help you, not just from a legal side point, but also from, again, an ethical standpoint and so on. Because I think a lot of people are a little confused about this. And I don't know how many companies would like the idea of putting something out on the internet about themselves that is not copyrightable. The risk is that something that is human generated and it is copyrighted and therefore IP, intellectual property, belonging to the company. I suspect that if they used it in an AI generated video, it may end up not being covered anymore by intellectual property. And I don't think any company wants to run that risk. So if you tomorrow morning create something with AI and try to copyright it, the answer would be no, you can't.